The ballroom glittered with a cold, unforgiving light, the kind that magnifies flaws and exposes insecurities. For Colette, standing in a simple, elegant navy dress she'd owned for 5 years, it felt like a spotlight. The whispers followed her like a shadow, sharp and laced with the casual cruelty of the ultra-wealthy. "Is that what she's wearing?" one woman murmured behind a champagne flute. Her husband Gavin shifted beside her, his smile tight, his shame a palpable heat between them. They saw a poor wife, a charity case clinging to her husband's coattails. They saw a nobody. What they couldn't see was the truth. They weren't in their world. They were in hers, and she was about to burn it to the ground. The annual Beaumont Foundation Charity Gala was the apex of the city's social calendar, a meticulously orchestrated performance of wealth and philanthropy. Conrad Beaumont, CEO of the sprawling real estate empire. Beaumont Enterprises and his wife Beatrice ruled this glittering kingdom. To be invited was to be anointed. To be noticed was to be made. For Gavin, a senior project manager at Beaumont Enterprises this night was everything. It was his chance to finally break into the inner circle to secure the vice president position Conrad had been dangling like a prize for months. And Colette was in his mind, the anchor threatening to sink his ambitions. "Did you have to wear that dress?" Colette Gavin hissed as they handed their coats to an attendant. "I told you the budget was open. We could have gone to Neiman Marcus Saks and spend 3 months of our mortgage on a dress I'll wear once." "No, thank you," Colette replied calmly, her voice a low counterpoint to the symphony of clinking glasses and forced laughter. "Besides, I like this dress. It was a gift from my grandmother." Gavin winced. "That's precisely the problem. It has a history. People here, they appreciate new things, expensive things." Colette simply looked at him, her grey eyes clear and steady. She saw the desperation swimming in his, the frantic need for approval from people who wouldn't recognize him in a grocery store. She had married Gavin for his warmth, his easy laugh, the future he'd painted for them filled with simple joys. But over the last few years, as he climbed the ladder at Beaumont Enterprises, that warmth had been replaced by a feverish ambition, a hunger to be one of them. Their entrance into the main ballroom went largely unnoticed, which was a small mercy. The room was a sea of designer gowns and bespoke tuxedos. Diamonds glittered on every wrist and throat, a constellation of manufactured stars. Beatrice Beaumont, a formidable woman, sculpted by Pilates and disdain, stood at the center of the room holding court. She was flanked by her coterie of wives women, whose full-time job was to be wealthy. "Gavin, darling." Beatrice's voice cut through the chatter. She glided towards them, her crimson gown shimmering. Her eyes sharp as a hawk's, swept over Gavin in approval, before landing on Colette with a barely concealed sneer. "So glad you could make it. And you brought your wife." The pause was deliberate, a small, cruel twist of the knife. "Beatrice, you look stunning." Gavin gushed, his back straightening. "This is Colette." Beatrice's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Colette." "Of course. We've met, haven't we?" "At the company picnic. You were the one in the sandals." She turned to her friends, a silent invitation to join the assessment. A woman with an improbable amount of platinum blonde hair, whose name Colette thought was Brenda, stepped forward. "Oh, that's a quaint dress, dear," Brenda said, her tone dripping with false sweetness. "Is it vintage?" "It's classic," Colette corrected gently, refusing to be baited. Beatrice let out a short, sharp laugh. "That's one word for it. Gavin, You must let me introduce you to Mr. Henderson from the Zoning Commission. Colette. Dear, you can. Well, the bar is over there. Try not to get lost. With a dismissive flick of her wrist, Beatrice led Gavin away, leaving Colette standing alone in the swirling tide of high society. The mockery was not subtle. It was a blood sport, and she was the evening's entertainment. She could feel their eyes on her, their whispers dissecting her simple dress, her lack of jewelry, her quiet demeanor. They saw weakness. They saw a woman who didn't belong. She made her way to the bar, not for a drink, but for a vantage point. From the edge of the room, she watched her husband. She saw him laugh a little too loudly at Conrad Beaumont's jokes. She saw him nod eagerly, his posture deferential, almost pleading. He was a chameleon, changing his colors to match the opulent wallpaper, desperate to blend in. And in his desperate attempt to belong, he had left her completely exposed. Later, during a lull in the forced merriment, Conrad himself approached her. He was a large man, accustomed to taking up space. "So you're the little wife," he said, his voice a low rumble. He didn't bother with her name. "Gavin's a good man, works hard. A bit rough around the edges, but we can smooth those out. He just needs the right support system." His gaze swept over her again, the same dismissive look as his wife's. You know, a wife's appearance reflects on her husband. It tells people what he's worth, what he can afford. The implication was as clear as the flawless diamond on his pinky finger. In their world, Colette was a liability, a walking, talking symbol of Gavin's inadequacy. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of slights and condescending smiles. Colette maintained her composure, a small, still island in a sea of arrogance. But inside a cold, hard knot was forming in her stomach. It wasn't just the humiliation. It was the dawning, painful realization that the man she loved was willing to sacrifice her dignity for a seat at their table. The car ride home was thick with a suffocating silence. Finally, Gavin spoke, his voice strained. "You could have at least tried, Colette. Tried to do what Gavin Cower. Apologize for not being one of them. No, tried to fit in, to network, to help me. My entire career was in that room, and you stood in a corner looking like a frightened mouse in a dress from a thrift store." The words hit her harder than any of the snide remarks from Beatrice's friends. "That dress was my grandmother's," she said, her voice dangerously quiet. "I don't care whose it was." He exploded, his frustration boiling over. "It made us look poor. It made me look weak." Conrad even commented on it. He said a man is judged by the company he keeps. What do you think he meant by that? Colette turned to look out the window, watching the city lights blur into streaks of cold fire. The man beside her was a stranger. The warmth was gone, burned away by the glittering empty promises of a world she wanted no part of. She didn't say another word. She didn't need to. The battle lines had been drawn not just between her and the Beaumonts, but within the walls of her own marriage. And as she stared into the darkness, the cold knot in her stomach began to feel less like pain and more like resolve. The days following the gala were strained. A chasm had opened between Colette and Gavin, a silent, echoing space filled with unspoken resentments. Gavin threw himself into his work with a renewed, almost manic intensity, chasing the phantom of the VP promotion. He started staying late, attending after-work drinks with colleagues he used to despise, and speaking in the clipped corporate jargon he once mocked. Their small, comfortable home began to feel like a hotel where Gavin would stop to sleep, shower, and change into another suit. Colette in turn retreated into herself. She continued her quiet routine, volunteering at the local library, tending to her small garden, and managing their household finances with a meticulousness that was currently the only thing keeping them afloat. Gavin's lavish spending on new suits from Brooks Brothers and expensive dinners to impress his superiors was draining their savings at an alarming rate. One evening, Gavin came home later than usual, smelling of expensive whiskey and giddy with a fragile excitement. He tossed a glossy brochure onto the kitchen island where Colette was paying bills. "Get ready to pack your bags," he announced, pulling off his tie. "Conrad's invited us to the annual executive retreat in Aspen. It's for VPs and above, but he's making an exception for me." "For us?" "This is it, Colette. This is the final test." Colette picked up the brochure. It featured a sprawling 5-star mountain lodge with photos of people in designer ski gear laughing around a roaring fire. The price per night discreetly listed in the corner was more than their monthly mortgage payment. "Gavin, we can't afford this," she said quietly, gesturing to the stack of bills. "The credit card is nearly maxed out from all of this." "Don't worry about the money," he said, dismissively waving a hand. "Consider it an investment in our future. Conrad's footing the bill for the lodge, but we have to handle our own expenses. Flights, gear, dinners. It's important we look the part. Beatrice is organizing a casual dinner at the Little Nell. You know what that means. You'll need a new wardrobe. I have clothes, Gavin. You have sweaters." He shot back, his patience thinning. "You don't have an Aspen wardrobe. Colette, please, just for this one weekend, can you please just play the part? For me. For us." The desperation was back in his eyes, but this time it was laced with something else, a warning, a silent plea not to embarrass him again. Reluctantly feeling a deep sense of dread, she agreed. The days leading up to the trip were a whirlwind of forced transformation. Gavin took her shopping, steering her towards high-end boutiques she would never enter on her own. He stood by, tapping his foot impatiently as she tried on clothes that felt like costumes. He bought her a cashmere sweater set that cost $800, a designer parka, and leather boots with a heel that was utterly impractical for snow. Each purchase felt like he was erasing a piece of her and replacing it with a more acceptable, more expensive version. During this time, Colette began to notice cracks in the gleaming facade of Beaumont Enterprises. While organizing Gavin's home office, a space she normally avoided, she found a financial report he'd accidentally left on the printer. It wasn't the polished, public-facing quarterly report. It was a raw, internal document. Her eyes, trained from a past life she never spoke of, scanned the figures. The debt-to-equity ratio was dangerously high. The cash flow was negative. Several large-scale projects touted in the press as massive successes were leveraged with high-interest short-term loans. The company wasn't just stretched thin. It was on the verge of collapse. It was a house of cards, and Conrad Beaumont was busy polishing the windows while the foundation rotted away. She brought it up to Gavin that night, approaching the subject cautiously. "I saw the latest internal financials, Gav. The numbers on the Phoenix Towers project look precarious." Gavin snatched the paper from her hand, his face paling. "Where did you get this?" "You shouldn't be looking at this stuff, Colette. It's confidential. It was on the printer. I'm worried. The company's leverage is immense. One bad quarter, one market dip, and everything could. Everything is fine." He snapped, his voice sharp with fear. "Conrad has a plan. He's a genius. You don't understand this world. These are complex financial instruments, not a household budget. Just focus on packing for Aspen and leave the business to me. He was terrified. But he wasn't terrified of the company collapsing. He was terrified of Colette being right, of his entire ambition being built on sand. He chose willful ignorance, a blind faith in the man who held his future in his hands. The conversation was over. Colette knew she couldn't push it further without him shutting her out completely. But the knowledge settled in her gut like a cold stone. They were flying into the heart of the storm, celebrating the success of a company that was secretly drowning, and her husband, blinded by the glitter, was tying both of their ankles to the anchor. She packed the new expensive clothes into a suitcase, each item feeling heavier than the last, weighed down by the secrets she now carried. The air in Aspen was thin and sharp, smelling of pine and money. The mountain lodge was even more opulent than the brochure had promised, a cathedral of exposed timber stone fireplaces and floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out onto breathtaking snow-covered peaks. But the beauty of the landscape was lost on Colette. The entire retreat felt like a stage, and every executive and their spouse was playing a part. The performance began the moment they checked in. Beatrice Beaumont, draped in a white fur-trimmed coat, greeted them with a smile that was all teeth. "Colette, you made it, and look at you. That's a lovely coat. Montclair, isn't it? I'm so glad Gavin managed to get you something appropriate for the mountains." The backhanded compliment was delivered with practiced ease. Gavin beamed, preening under the faint praise. "Only the best for my wife," he said, squeezing Colette's shoulder possessively. The weekend was a carefully curated series of events designed to reinforce the company's hierarchy. There were ski outings where Conrad Beaumont effortlessly carved down black diamond slopes, while others struggled to keep up. There were après-ski gatherings where business deals were whispered over glasses of vintage wine. And through it all, Colette was an observer, a ghost at the feast. The other wives spoke a language she didn't understand, a dialect of gossip nannies, charity committees, and summer homes in the Hamptons. They sized her up, their eyes flicking over her new expensive clothes, searching for any crack in the facade. Colette played her part. She smiled politely, made small talk when necessary, and endured the thinly veiled condescension. She knew that for Gavin her compliance was paramount. But as she watched the hollow spectacle, the financial report she'd seen was a constant hum in the back of her mind. These people were celebrating on a sinking ship, toasting to their own brilliance as the water rose around their ankles. One afternoon, while Gavin was in a strategy session with Conrad and the other VPs, Colette decided to skip the scheduled spa day with the wives. She needed airspace a moment away from the suffocating pretense. Bundled in her new parka, she walked along a quiet, snow-dusted trail that wound away from the lodge. As she rounded a bend, she heard voices. Hushed, urgent. Conrad Beaumont and another man, one of the company's senior legal counsels, were standing half-hidden by a grove of aspen trees, clearly believing they were alone. "Can't keep shuffling the money between shell corporations forever," Conrad the lawyer, a man named Peterson, was saying, his voice tight with anxiety. "The auditors from Deloitte are getting suspicious. They've requested full access to the Phoenix Towers and the new waterfront development ledgers. We can't cook those books. We don't need to cook them. We just need to stall." Conrad grumbled, his voice a low, angry growl. "The deal with the Japanese investors is almost closed. Once their capital injection comes through, we can plug the holes. It's a temporary liquidity problem, that's all. It stopped being a liquidity problem when you started using funds from the pension plan to cover the cost overruns," Peterson hissed. That's not just a civil liability, Conrad. That's a federal crime. We're talking about wire fraud, embezzlement. If this blows up, we're not just going to be ruined, we're going to be imprisoned. Colette froze her blood, turning to ice. It was worse than she thought. This wasn't just mismanagement. It was outright criminal activity. They were stealing from their own employees to prop up a lie. She backed away slowly, her heart pounding in her chest, every nerve ending screaming. She had to get away before they saw her. She retreated to their room, the grand mountain view now looking sinister and oppressive. Her mind raced, processing the information. The pieces clicked into place, the desperation for new investors, the doctored financials. Conrad's unshakable arrogance, it was the confidence of a gambler on a losing streak, betting everything on one last hand. Her first instinct was to tell Gavin, to show him the truth, to pull him back from the precipice before he was implicated in the inevitable collapse. She waited for him in their room, pacing the floor, the damning conversation echoing in her head. He returned hours later, his cheeks flushed with cold and excitement. "You won't believe it," he said, shrugging off his coat. Conrad practically confirmed it. He said he's creating a new senior VP position to oversee the international expansion. He said he needs a man he can trust, a man with vision. He was looking right at me. Colette. Colette looked at his hopeful, deluded face, and the words died in her throat. How could she tell him? How could she explain that the kingdom he was so desperate to enter was a rotten, hollow shell? He wouldn't believe her. He would accuse her of being jealous of trying to sabotage him. He had placed his faith completely in Conrad Beaumont, and challenging that faith would be like challenging his religion. She made a decision. A hard, cold decision, born of the afternoon's terrifying revelation. She couldn't save Gavin from himself. He had made his choice, tethered his fate to Conrad's. But she could protect herself. And more importantly, she could do something about the injustice she had uncovered. That night, Colette sat by the window long after Gavin had fallen into a deep, contented sleep. She pulled out her laptop, a simple, unassuming device. For years, she had kept her past life dormant, a secret locked away. She was once one of the most respected forensic accountants and crisis managers in the corporate world, known only by a pseudonym, Cassandra, a nod to the prophetess no one believed. She had walked away from it all 5 years ago, after a brutal hostile takeover case left her burnt out and disillusioned, wanting nothing more than a simple, quiet life. The life she had tried to build with Gavin. With quiet, deliberate keystrokes, she began to type. She wasn't just Colette anymore. She was reactivating old networks, accessing secure servers, and pulling on threads that would unravel the entire corrupt tapestry of Beaumont Enterprises. The storm was no longer gathering. It had arrived, and she was directing the lightning. The final night of the retreat was the grand finale, a formal dinner held at a Michelin-starred restaurant in town, the Little Nell. It was the night Conrad was expected to make his big announcements, the night all of Gavin's hopes and anxieties would culminate. The air in their suite was thick with tension as they got ready. Gavin fussed with his tuxedo, adjusting his bow tie a dozen times in the mirror. "How do I look?" he asked, his voice tight. "You look fine, Gavin," Colette said, fastening a simple pair of pearl earrings, the only jewelry she'd brought besides her wedding ring. She was wearing a sleek black column dress. It was one of the purchases Gavin had insisted on, and while it was beautiful, it felt alien on her skin. "Fine. Just fine," he snapped. Colette, this is the most important night of my career. I need to look better than fine. We need to look better than fine. Colette took a deep breath. You look handsome and successful. You look like you belong. The words were a bitter pill, but they were what he needed to hear. He visibly relaxed, a small, grateful smile touching his lips. The restaurant was an enclave of hushed elegance and staggering wealth. Their group, the Beaumont Inner Circle, was seated at a long table in a private dining room. The mood was celebratory. Conrad was holding court at the head of the table, booming with laughter, every inch the conquering king. Colette sat in silence, picking at her food, the weight of her knowledge, a physical presence beside her. She had spent the last 24 hours in a feverish, clandestine effort. Working through encrypted channels, she had anonymously compiled a dossier on Beaumont Enterprises' criminal activities and forwarded it to two places, the SEC's whistleblower division and the board of directors of Ethelred Holdings, a powerful, press-shy global investment firm she knew had been quietly looking for a major acquisition in the real estate sector. She had laid the dynamite. She was just waiting for the fuse to be lit. Halfway through the main course, Conrad stood tapping his wine glass for attention. Friends, colleagues, he began beaming. It's been a fantastic year for Beaumont Enterprises. Our growth has been unprecedented, our vision unmatched, and that's thanks to the hard work of the people in this room. He launched into a self-congratulatory speech, praising his team, but mostly himself. Gavin sat on the edge of his seat, his eyes fixed on Conrad, his expression rapt. And as we look to the future, to our global expansion, Conrad continued, his eyes sweeping the table. We need new leadership. We need to promote from within, to reward loyalty and vision. That's why I'm proud to announce the creation of a new role, Senior Vice President of Global Strategy. This was it. Gavin's entire body tensed. He was practically holding his breath. Conrad paused for dramatic effect, and I can think of no one better to fill that role than my own son-in-law, Robert. A polite, slightly surprised applause rippled through the room. Robert, a smug-looking man who ran the company's smallest and least successful division, preened beside his wife, Conrad's daughter. Colette looked at Gavin. The color had drained from his face. His expression was one of pure, slack-jawed shock, followed by a wave of crushing humiliation. He had been played. The promotion was never his. He was just a pawn, a workhorse Conrad had used to motivate the rest of the team, a fool to be discarded when he was no longer useful. Beatrice, who had been watching Gavin's reaction with undisguised amusement, leaned across the table. "Oh, Gavin, don't look so glum," she said, her voice syrupy sweet. "There will be other opportunities. Not everyone is cut out for the big leagues after all. Perhaps you're just more of a middle management sort of man." The insult was deliberate, public, and devastating. The others at the table smirked into their napkins. Gavin was frozen speechless, his public castration complete. Colette felt a surge of pity for him, followed by a cold, hard anger. He had debased himself for these people, compromised his integrity, and sacrificed her dignity, all for a lie. And then it got worse. Conrad, perhaps feeling a pang of performative guilt, or more likely just wanting to cement his power, turned his attention to Colette. "You know, Gavin," he said, his voice loud enough for the whole table to hear. "Maybe Beatrice is right. A man's ambition needs fuel. A proper wife, one who understands her role, can be a great asset. Someone who hosts the right parties, knows the right people, not someone who shows up to the company's most important event looking like a librarian." He chuckled, and the rest of the table joined in a chorus of cruel laughter. Colette sat perfectly still, her face a mask of calm. But inside every last vestige of feeling for the man sitting next to her, for the life they had built, shattered. She looked at Gavin, waiting for him to defend her, to say something, anything. He just stared at his plate, his face ashen, his silence, a deafening roar of cowardice. He didn't look at her. He didn't speak. In the moment of her ultimate humiliation, he abandoned her completely. That was the final betrayal. Slowly, deliberately, Colette placed her napkin on the table. She stood up. The laughter quieted as all eyes turned toward her. "Thank you, Conrad." "Beatrice," she said, her voice clear and steady, cutting through the silence. "You have been remarkably illuminating." She looked directly at Gavin, her gaze holding his for a long, painful moment. He flinched, unable to meet her eyes. "Enjoy your dinner," she said to the room at large. Then, with a dignity that eclipsed every ounce of their manufactured prestige, she turned and walked out of the restaurant, leaving her husband, her marriage, and her old life behind her in the wreckage. She didn't look back. Colette didn't go back to the hotel room. She walked out into the frigid aspen night, the cold air a welcome shock to her system, clearing the last vestiges of hurt and leaving only a diamond-hard clarity in its place. She took a taxi directly to the local airport, a small private hub for the wealthy. Using a credit card under a name no one in her current life would recognize, Cassandra Hale, she chartered a private jet. It was an extravagant expense, but it was a necessary one. Time was now her most valuable asset. As the jet climbed into the dark sky, leaving the glittering prison of Aspen behind, Colette opened her laptop. The quiet hum of the engines was the only sound as she transformed. The meek, unassuming wife was gone, stripped away by layers of betrayal and humiliation. In her place was Cassandra, the strategist, the corporate raider, the woman who could see the rot in a company's foundation from 1,000 miles away. Her phone, a secure satellite device she hadn't used in years, buzzed to life. It was Peterson, her old right-hand man, a fiercely loyal and brilliant analyst who had managed her private firm in her absence. "The board of Ethelred received your package, Cassandra." His voice was crisp, professional. "They convened an emergency session an hour ago. They're moving. The offer goes live at market open tomorrow. They want to know your terms." "My terms are non-negotiable," Colette said, her eyes fixed on the screen, which displayed a complex web of Beaumont's corporate structure. "I want full operational control post-acquisition. I'm not just handing them a target. I'm delivering a restructured, profitable company. My title will be CEO." There was a pause on the other end. "They'll push back. They'll want one of their own people." "They can push all they want," Colette replied coldly. "I have the leverage. I know where every single fraudulent transaction is buried. I know which pension funds were raided. Without me to navigate the cleanup, the SEC will gut the company for parts before they can even get the keys to the executive washroom. They get the asset, but I am the asset manager. Make them understand." "Understood," Peterson said, a hint of admiration in his voice. "Consider it done." For the rest of the flight, Colette worked with a relentless, focused intensity. She wasn't just planning a corporate takeover, she was orchestrating a revolution. She drafted a new organizational chart. She compiled termination notices, starting with Conrad Beaumont and his entire inner circle. She scheduled a series of calls with Ethelred's legal and financial teams, directing them with an authority that left them scrambling to keep up. She was not just taking over a company, She was reclaiming her own life on her own terms. The quiet, simple life she had craved had been an illusion, a sanctuary built on a foundation of Gavin's lies and insecurities. The real her wasn't the woman who tended a garden. It was the woman who could command a boardroom and dismantle an empire with a few keystrokes. She had hidden that part of herself away, thinking it was a source of past pain. But now she realized it was her greatest source of strength. She landed in New York before dawn, the city a sprawling galaxy of lights against the dark horizon. She was met on the tarmac not by a town car, but by a team from Ethelred Holdings. They were expecting a mysterious consultant. They were not expecting the unassuming woman in a simple black dress. Their initial surprise quickly turned to respect as she immediately began issuing clear, concise directives, demonstrating a grasp of the situation that was light years ahead of their own. By the time the New York Stock Exchange opened at 9:30 a.m., the plan was in motion. Ethelred Holdings announced a tender offer for all outstanding shares of Beaumont Enterprises at a premium well above its current artificially inflated stock price. Simultaneously, the SEC, acting on the detailed information from Colette's whistleblower report, announced a formal investigation into the company's accounting practices and froze the assets of several key executives, including Conrad Beaumont. Panic erupted. The stock price of Beaumont Enterprises, once a darling of the real estate sector, plummeted in pre-market trading before being halted altogether. News channels began running kions about fraud and a hostile takeover. In Aspen, Gavin would be waking up not just to a hangover and the sting of his public humiliation, but to the news that the world he had sacrificed everything for was imploding. He would be trying to call Conrad, only to find his boss was preoccupied with lawyers and federal agents. He would be scrambling, confused, and terrified. Colette felt a flicker of something, a ghost of pity, but she extinguished it. He had made his bed. He had chosen his side. Her focus was on the future, on the company she was about to seize and remake. In a glass-walled conference room high above Manhattan, Colette stood before the assembled Ethelred team. "Conrad Beaumont will call an emergency board meeting," she said, her voice calm and commanding. "He will try to rally them to fight the takeover. He will fail. The board is already compromised. Most of them are aware of the fraud and terrified of being implicated. When our formal request for the meeting arrives, they will grant it immediately. I will attend that meeting in person." One of the Ethelred executives, a senior partner named David Chen, looked at her. "You think that's wise to walk in there yourself?" Colette turned to him, a faint, cold smile on her lips. "It's not about wisdom, Mr. Chen. It's about justice. And justice is a dish best served in person." The emergency board meeting of Beaumont Enterprises was convened in an atmosphere of barely controlled panic. The boardroom, located on the top floor of the gleaming Beaumont Tower, was usually a symbol of power and invincibility. Today it felt like a bunker under siege. The long mahogany table was surrounded by grim-faced men and women, the directors of the board, their faces pale and their BlackBerries buzzing with frantic messages from brokers and lawyers. At the head of the table, Conrad Beaumont attempted to project an aura of command, but the facade was cracking. His face was blotchy, his usual confident bluster replaced by a raw, defensive anger. Gavin was also in the room, standing stiffly against the wall behind Conrad. He had been summoned from Aspen not as a future VP, but as a glorified assistant tasked with preparing documents he didn't understand, a last petty humiliation from his boss. His eyes were wide with fear and confusion, darting around the room as if searching for an escape route. This is nothing more than a predatory, opportunistic attack. Conrad boomed, his fist hitting the table. Ethelred Holdings is a vulture fund trying to steal this company. Our company, based on baseless, slanderous rumors. The SEC investigation is a witch hunt, a formality. We will fight this, and we will win. His words, usually so effective, fell flat. The board members exchanged nervous glances. They knew, or at least suspected, how close to the truth the rumors were. "What is our strategy?" Conrad asked a silver-haired director named Margaret. "Our stock is worthless, our assets are frozen, and the feds are crawling all over our books. How exactly do we fight?" Before Conrad could answer, the double doors to the boardroom opened. His executive assistant leaned in, her face ashen. "Mr. Beaumont, there's someone here from Ethelred Holdings." "They're demanding to address the board. Tell them to go to hell," Conrad roared. "I'm afraid that won't be possible," a quiet, firm voice said. Every head in the room turned. Standing in the doorway was Colette. She was no longer the invisible wife in the corner. She wore a perfectly tailored charcoal grey suit. Her hair was pulled back in a severe professional style, and her eyes held a gaze of cool, unyielding authority. She was flanked by two formidable-looking lawyers from Ethelred's legal team. A wave of stunned slants rolled through the room. Gavin stared, his jaw hanging open, his mind utterly failing to process what he was seeing. Beatrice Beaumont, who was also on the board, thanks to her family's initial investment, gasped audibly. "Colette, what in God's name are you doing here?" Conrad sputtered, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple. "This is a private meeting. Security." "They won't be necessary, Conrad," Colette said, her voice echoing in the silent room as she walked calmly to the empty seat at the far end of the table. "As the representative for the entity that now controls a 51% stake in this company's voting shares, I believe I have a right to be here." The statement landed like a bomb. Ethelred hadn't just made an offer. They had already secured a controlling interest through back-channel agreements with terrified major shareholders who wanted to get out before the ship sank completely. "That's impossible," Beatrice shrieked, her carefully constructed composure shattering. "You're nobody. You're Gavin's pathetic little wife." Colette ignored her, her gaze sweeping over the stunned faces of the board members. "My name is Colette Hale. For the past decade, I have operated professionally under the name Cassandra. I am the founder and principal of Hale Advisory, the firm responsible for structuring and executing Ethelred's acquisition of this company." Gavin felt the floor drop out from under him. Colette Hale, Cassandra Hale, the name on the mysterious credit cards and bank accounts he'd sometimes see on their statements, which she'd always dismissed as a small inheritance trust. It was all a lie. His quiet, unassuming wife was Cassandra, the legendary corporate fixer, the ghost who dismantled companies. He felt a wave of nausea. "My first order of business," Colette continued, her voice like ice, "is to accept the resignations of this entire board effective immediately." She slid a stack of folders down the polished table. "My team has prepared severance agreements that are conditional upon your full cooperation with the ongoing federal investigation. I suggest you sign them." She then turned her full attention to Conrad. "Conrad Beaumont, you are terminated for cause. Your assets have been frozen pending the outcome of the SEC's investigation into your embezzlement of employee pension funds and rampant securities fraud. I imagine the U.S. Attorney's Office will be in touch shortly. Conrad collapsed into his chair, the fight draining out of him, replaced by the grey pallor of utter ruin. Colette's gaze then fell upon Beatrice. Beatrice, your family's shares are now worthless. The foundation will be dissolved and its assets audited. I trust you'll find that life without the Beaumont name to protect you is quaint. Finally, her eyes landed on Gavin. He stood against the wall, paralyzed a deer in the headlights of an oncoming train. He looked pathetic, a small, broken man who had bet on the wrong horse and lost everything. Colette walked slowly towards him, the click of her heels on the marble floor, the only sound. She stopped directly in front of him. The entire room held its breath. They were expecting a final vicious blow, a public firing, a declaration of revenge. Instead, she spoke softly, her voice for his ears only. Was it worth it, Gavin? Was the approval of these people, this empty, gilded life, worth your soul? He couldn't speak. He just stared at her, at this stranger who had been his wife, a woman of immense power and brilliance, whom he had treated like a liability. She didn't wait for an answer. She simply turned her back on him, a final, quiet act of dismissal that was more profound than any angry outburst. She faced the remnants of the board, her posture radiating a power they had never known. "The company is now under new management," she announced. A murmur of shock and awe went through the Ethelred lawyers and the few remaining staff in the room. One of the junior executives, a young woman who had always been kind to Colette at company events, whispered to another, her voice filled with disbelief. "It's her. They're calling her Madam CEO." In the chaotic weeks that followed, the boardroom coup, the name Colette Hale became a legend whispered through the hallowed halls of finance. The story spun in the pages of the Wall Street Journal, and Forbes was a modern corporate fairy tale, the quiet, underestimated wife who emerged from obscurity to become the brilliant CEO, orchestrating the stunning takeover of the very company that had scorned her. Journalists painted her as a ruthless strategist, a prodigy returned from a self-imposed exile. They saw the victory, the power, the sensational headlines. What they couldn't see was the quiet, deliberate process of a woman not seeking revenge, but meticulously reclaiming the pieces of a life she had allowed to be diminished. Her first day in the CEO's office, Conrad's former throne room, was a study in contrasts. The space was opulent, masculine, and suffocating, filled with dark wood leather and egotistical trophies. Colette walked in and immediately opened the blinds, flooding the room with morning light. The remaining executive staff, accustomed to Conrad's tyrannical rages and false bonhomie, were terrified. They expected a purge, a reign of vengeful fury. Instead, Colette convened a meeting with the department heads and spoke with a calm, disarming clarity that was more commanding than any shouted order. She didn't talk about the past. She asked about the present. She listened. She assessed. Within hours, it was clear that a new formidable intelligence was in control. Her work was surgical. She wasn't just rebuilding a company. She was performing an ethical transplant. Conrad's entire C-suite, the sycophants and enablers who had propped up his corrupt regime, were dismissed. In their place, she promoted talented, overlooked individuals from within the company and recruited respected leaders from the outside people, known for their integrity as much as their skill. 2 weeks into her tenure, she called a company-wide town hall meeting. The atmosphere in the auditorium was thick with anxiety. These were the people, the project managers, accountants, administrative staff, whose futures had been gambled with, whose retirement funds had been pillaged. Colette walked onto the stage, not behind a podium, but to its center, standing openly before them. "My name is Colette Hale," she began, her voice steady and clear, amplified through the room. "I know there is a lot of fear and uncertainty right now. You have been betrayed by the previous leadership. Your trust was broken, and your financial security was compromised. That ends today." She paused, letting the words sink in. "My first official act as CEO was to establish a protected, insured fund. As of this morning, every single dollar that was embezzled from the employee pension plan, along with compensatory interest, has been returned. Your retirement is secure. That is not a promise. It is a fact." A wave of stunned silence was followed by a ripple of applause that grew into a thunderous, emotional ovation. For the first time in months, the employees of the company felt a glimmer of hope. Colette had not just given them back their money, she had given them back their dignity. From the ashes of Conrad Beaumont's greed, she was building something new, something strong. The company was officially rebranded as Phoenix Holdings, a name that became synonymous with one of the most remarkable corporate turnarounds in a decade. The fallout for her former tormentors was a public spectacle. Colette avoided watching the news, but it was unavoidable. She caught a glimpse one evening of Conrad Beaumont, his face ashen and haggard, being led from a courthouse in handcuffs, surrounded by a scrum of reporters. The arrogant titan who had judged her worth based on her dress was now a federal defendant, his legacy reduced to a mugshot and a list of criminal charges. A week later, a society blog published a story about Beatrice Beaumont. She had attended a charity auction, an event she would have chaired in her previous life, only to be ostracized, the other women turning their backs on her with the same casual cruelty she had once perfected. Stripped of her husband's power and money, she was nothing. Her divorce filing was quiet, a final desperate attempt to sever her name from the ruin. And Gavin. His was not a fall from a great height, but a slow, quiet slide into irrelevance. As she had decreed, his termination was handled impersonally by the new head of human resources. He was a loose end, a relic of a defunct regime. He was left with nothing but crippling debt and the ghosts of his squandered potential. He had worshipped at a false altar, and now the temple had crumbled, leaving him alone in the dust. Colette saw him one last time 3 months later. She was leaving the Phoenix Tower at dusk, the autumn air crisp and cool. As her driver pulled the car to the curb, her eyes were drawn to a figure standing across the street, huddled under the awning of a closed shop to escape a light, persistent drizzle. It was Gavin. He was staring up at the tower, his former kingdom, a place where he was now not even welcome in the lobby. He looked gaunt, lost a man, hollowed out by his own choices. As if feeling her gaze, he turned his head, and their eyes met across the stream of rushing traffic. In that fleeting moment, Colette saw it all in his expression: the shock, the shame, and a desperate, bottomless well of regret. He saw her in the back of the sleek town car, a figure of serene power, a world away from the woman he had abandoned in that restaurant. It was a chasm that could never be crossed. Colette held his gaze for a beat, feeling not a spark of triumph, not a flicker of hatred, but a profound and sorrowful emptiness where her love for him once lived. It was the detached pity one feels for a tragedy of one's own making. Then she gave her driver a quiet nod. The car pulled smoothly into traffic, and she didn't look back. Later that evening, in her own office, the one she had redesigned with clean lines, light woods, and open spaces, She stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows. The city spread out before her, a breathtaking tapestry of light and life. She thought of the woman in the simple navy dress, the one who had stood in the corner of a glittering ballroom, enduring the whispers and the scorn. She didn't feel pity for that woman anymore. She felt a deep, abiding pride. That woman hadn't broken. She had absorbed every slight, every betrayal, and she had transformed that pain, not into brittle anger, but into a core of unshakable steel. They had mocked her for being a poor wife, an accessory, a nobody. Now they called her Madam CEO. But the title was just a label. The reality was the woman who had earned it, the woman who had faced down her own demons and the greed of others, and emerged whole. She was Colette Hale, and for the first time in a very long time she was finally completely herself. And so Colette Hale's story teaches us a powerful lesson about the masks we wear and the strength we hide within. She was judged by the cover of a book they never bothered to open, dismissed for her simple clothes and quiet nature, all while possessing a mind that could move mountains and topple empires. Her journey reminds us that true worth isn't measured in designer labels or social status, but in resilience, integrity, and the courage to be true to yourself, even when the world demands you be someone else. How many of us have been underestimated, judged, or made to feel small? Colette's story is a testament to the fire that can be ignited when someone tries to extinguish your light. If her incredible journey from being a mocked wife to Madam CEO resonated with you, please take a moment to hit that like button. Share this story with someone who might need a reminder of their own inner power. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and ring that notification bell so you won't miss our next story of unbelievable twists and ultimate vindication. Thank you for listening.